Okay, I'd like to call to order the January 27th meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. In the absence of our chair, I will chair the meeting. First order of business is the approval of, well, the first order of business really should be, since we have two new people sitting at the table with us here, would be a round of introductions. And I will start by saying that I'm Joel Hamilton. I'm retired from the University of Idaho. I live on Orchard Avenue. And I've been on this commission since 1981.
Oh my.
I've been chair a few times. I also serve on the Transportation Commission, so it's sort of a liaison person between the two commissions. Rebecca?
I'm Rebecca Rod, and I've been on the Planning and Zonings for, is it 2 years now? Or a year and a half? Something like that. And I've been a Moscow resident since 1984. I'm a semi-retired. I am an artist, and yeah, kind of feeling my way along with this commission here. It's been really interesting.
I'm Kurt Obermeyer. Been, I think that was my 5th year, something like that. Trying to move from semi-retired to fully retired, but it doesn't seem to work out ever.
Nels Rees. I'm also a retired University of Idaho professor, architecture professor. I've been on the commission. I can't match Joel, but I'm edging toward 20 years on the commission as well. And I also sit on the Historic Preservation Commission as well. So I've come to enjoy this building and the people who represent the folks in Moscow a lot. It's been quite a pleasure.
Good. Well, my name's Dennis Wilson. I'm one of the new guys. I'm a local business owner, property owner, husband, father of 4, coach a lot of basketball, coach a lot of football, coach a lot of baseball. All 3 of them. The boys are in, the girls in the volleyball. Got 2 left at home. Like I said, my mom lives here. She's lived here. I've been here since '92. I've kind of dabbed in a few boards like the Moscow Bear Boosters and a few Moscow Baseball Association. But this is my first day here, so looking forward to learning from you guys and jumping into it.
Mike Ray, staff liaison, born in 1981, so I guess I'm old as Joel's on the commission. So.
I'm Rob Parrish. I retired a couple times and am currently fully retired. I was a Foreign Service Officer with Agency for International Development, retired from that. More recently retired as the manager of the Moscow Pullman Airport, and now I am happily fully retired. A couple of grown kids. We live up on University Heights, and I'm just finishing my first year on the commission.
Hi, I'm Catherine Bozzo. I was elected in November. I'm your council representative.
And I'm Greg Dickinson. I am, I think this is the same amount of time as Rebecca on the commission. At the same time. I'm the corporate counsel and HR manager for MZ over on Jackson Street. So I've lived in Moscow since 1983.
Okay. Next item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes of our last meeting, December 10th. And they were in your packet. Are there any corrections or additions to those minutes? Not hearing any. Is there a motion?
Move to approve.
Second. We have a motion and a second. All in favor of approving the minutes as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Aye.
One of the traditions, which is probably not binding, but it's still a tradition, is that usually when people were absent during the meeting in question, they do abstain.
Okay.
So,
Just in case we had something important.
Right?
well, just in case something was in there that you want to disclaim later.
Well, no, I did read them, though, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is correspondence. Are there items of correspondence from staff?
Nothing from staff this evening.
Anything from members or council rep?
Nothing?
Nothing. The next item is the Transportation Commission report. Since I serve on that commission, actually, it's a very short report. We continued at our last meeting on January 14th discussing artistic bike racks and bicycle route wayfinding signs and bicycle route facilities. One thing that I should bring up, I guess, is that there's a discussion of artistic bike racks. And I think it's in collaboration between the Transportation Commission and the Art Commission to talk about what kinds of artistic bike racks might be put, especially in downtown, and where they might go, and what kinds of rules there might be for what they might look like, and so on. So that's ongoing. The next meeting of the Transportation Commission will be in 2 weeks, Thursday afternoon, 4 to 6 in this room. Next item, open microphone. Since we don't have anyone in the audience to participate in open microphone, this is a advertisement to anyone who might be watching us on television. It's a time which we have at each meeting, limited to 15 minutes, where members of the public can come in and may speak about matters that they think we ought to hear about, but they have to be matters that are not on the agenda and not likely to be on immediate future agendas of the Commission. So moving on to item 6 on the agenda. In our last meeting, we dealt with a comp plan change and zoning change on a parcel of property that was being annexed to the city, and today we need to pass on the reasoned statements that were generated by staff from the results of that meeting. So that material was in your packet, and I would entertain any comments, suggestions, corrections for the document that's before us. You're a very participatory group today.
We're just stunned by the amount of literature that Michael's been able to what was a fairly simple issue.
One question I had is whether it makes any difference that there is in fact no change in proposed use that is likely to result of these actions. Perhaps it doesn't make any difference because we're probably dealing with possible uses rather than actual uses. But any response to that, Michael?
As far as the land use amendment?
Yeah.
Changing? Yeah, I mean, and I think I've crafted it such that it reflects that there really wasn't a change. It was just having to go through the motions of, when it gets annexed, that you have to designate it as a comp plan designation.
But it's never stated in there that nobody's actually proposing any change of use. never stated
than
directly.
what it currently is.
Yeah.
I
And
guess-
maybe, as I say, maybe that's irrelevant.
Yeah, I guess that, underneath the future rezoning of that property would allow,
Right.
whatever's allowed underneath that zone,
Right.
which it could technically change
Yeah.
to at a future
Yeah.
date.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to emphasize that point that we're not talking about any change in use, changes in use are possible under what we agreed to last meeting.
Although I suppose if it's still consistent with the comp plan as
Yeah.
amended and the zoning, that would be.
Right. That's fine.
Yeah, but that's something that we have to pay attention to, is that we're okaying a potential different use of the property,
Right.
even though nothing is going to change, but that's
Yeah.
by approving it.
As we would in any
Yeah.
annexation. Wow. So, Dennis, in case you didn't see, this was a small piece of land that wanted to come into the city to be, make available the use of city water. So,
Yeah, I kind of watched the video at the Slurping Rip, and it was almost right there anyway, and yeah, seemed sensible.
So are we ready for a motion?
I move that we adopt the reasoned statement of relevant criteria and standards as presented.
As presented.
do we need to vote on each one, do you think?
I think it probably, just to make it cleaner, to have a motion on each one. Yeah.
So this is for the
Just for the comp plan.
Comp plan.
Okay.
comp plan. That should be
I'll
the next
second.
one.
Okay.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and second to approve the proposed reason statement for the comp plan. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. You want to make the parallel motion?
I move that we adopt the reasoned statement relevant standards and criteria for the rezone as presented.
Comments? Okay, we had a second from Kurt. Okay. All in favor of adopting that document, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? We are moving rapidly through the agenda. Thank you. Okay.
We could have a record setter here if you
If we don't have a hearing, we often sit down at the table or rules.
Okay. The next item deals with, rather than approving changes, deals more nearly with writing the rules. So, Michael, introduce our topic 7.
Thank you. Well, we'll be reviewing subdivision plats, relevant criteria and standards, and I believe that this does it for our criteria, so I think this is the last one on our list. So moving right through these, so that's exciting. Looking at subdivisions, we always start with the Local Land Use Planning Act and what the section of the state statutes say for each land use action, and under Subdivision Ordinance section of the Local Land Use Planning Act really doesn't give us any guidance as far as the criteria. Really the heart, I guess, of this section that you have to kind of drive home is each ordinance may provide for mitigation of the effects of subdivision development on the ability of political subdivisions of the state, including school districts, to deliver services without compromising quality of service, delivery to current residents, or imposing substantial additional costs upon current residents to accommodate the proposed subdivision. So just making sure that a subdivision isn't going to unduly burden the existing population of a city, and really under the state statutes, that's what a lot of our regulations have to relate back to. The rest of this chapter really deals with procedural process for processing subdivision plats. I did want to point out that we, under that subdivision section, the definition as defined by state code is a tract of land divided into 5 or more lots, parcels, or sites for the purpose of sale of building development, whether immediate or future. So, and then it has some exemptions for division of agricultural land for agricultural purposes. But this is a little bit different than what our city code defines as a subdivision. If you look at the end, it does give the option for cities or counties may adopt their own definition of subdivision in lieu of this definition. So it's fairly universal through the state that a lot of municipalities have the rule. They may have short plats where they maybe provide a little bit or require a little less of the applicant going through the process if it's maybe 2 to 4 lots that are getting platted. But anytime there's 5 or more, then you really have to go through the whole subdivision process. It's a little odd because our definition of a subdivision, if you read that paragraph there, is really anything. So we have a process. Right now the code's contradictory because we have subdivision defined as really division of anything. And we have a lot division process that we carry people through that says, that, it's consistent with the state statutes, and it says that, well, if you are only dividing up to 4 lots, then you can just go through this abbreviated process of going to, putting out notice and going through Public Works Finance Committee and then on to City Council for approval. So it's completely different than our typical subdivision process. But if you have 5 or more lots within the subdivision, then we go through what we have laid out under our code, even though the subdivision definition is contradictory to that. So that's just one of the things that we'll have to address through the update of the zoning code and then the update of the subdivision code as well, just to make sure that's going to be consistent.
Mike, do you know why Moscow adopted a different definition of subdivision than the local definition?
I don't know the origin of that definition. I know that it was brought to the city council at one point in time before my time, and the council wanted to go ahead and just continue processing the lot divisions similar to what we've done up to that point. And so I think it's probably about time that we take a look at that and revisit it and either continue with what we currently have with allowing just simple lot divisions up to 4 lots and then just maybe amend our definition of subdivision or define it a little bit differently and maybe say up to 2 lots you can just do a lot division, and then maybe over 2 requires you to go through the subdivision plat process.
I know I've always been a little bit uneasy with the 5 rule.
Good evening.
Yes.
Is this a public meeting?
Yes.
We are from U of I, and we are taking the transportation planning course.
Have a seat.
You're welcome. Come on in.
Okay, thank you. We want to see how you guys perform the public meeting.
I was going to say I've always been a little bit uneasy that the lot division rule allowed up to 5. I would guess I would have been more comfortable with something like 2 or 3 as a simple lot division.
Maybe that's why they changed it, so it can be lower.
Yeah, and I don't know why it was. I mean, it's consistent with state code that 5 or more is the preliminary plat, and the lot divisions, less than that. But not sure the reason.
Yeah. But we'll have a chance to visit that later.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Taking a look at our relevant criteria and standards for subdivisions, these are probably, looking back through all the criteria that we've reviewed, these are probably maybe the least in need of changing. A lot of them make a lot of sense. Usually it's tied back to the comprehensive plan just to make sure it's consistent with that. A little odd, the language. It just says it's not contradictory. Usually you'd say something like it's consistent with the comp plan. It's compatible with the zoning ordinance. Usually you wouldn't say it's compatible, but it really meets, it's consistent with the zoning ordinance or meets all the requirements contained within the zoning ordinance. It's just not, more compatibility is more of the comprehensive plan. plat's compatible with, same thing, you know, Moscow Subdivision Ordinance, well, it has to meet all the requirements of the Subdivision Ordinance in order to be approved. Plat's considerate of natural features of the subject land, and this is always a little bit of an odd one, because what do you define as natural features? You know, given our Palouse topography, there's always going to be some amount of grading that's going to have to occur as part of you know, subdivision development. How extensive that is you know, just, I guess, depends on where the subdivision's located. You know, usually you have standards that are built into your subdivision ordinance that may address, you know, things that you'd like to promote, like preservation of riparian areas adjacent to floodplains. You know, we have some of that already within our floodplain regulations. If you recall, we have that portion that we were making consistent when we went through the floodplain, our flood hazard areas section, when we did that code amendment to be consistent with FEMA's current regulations. I don't think we changed that section at all. We just kind of shifted it from the subdivision code to our zoning code under the floodplain regulations, but it's still there. So, you know, a lot of these things you would have just within the subdivision code or the zoning code itself, and you wouldn't have, you know, a statement that it's considerate of natural features, because it gets to be a little bit subjective. And then the plat's not expected to place an undue burden on public services and infrastructure, and does not pose an apparent threat to the public health, safety, and welfare. So you've kind of got a two-part sentence there. Usually you don't want to place an undue burden on public services and infrastructure, and that's a little, you know, typically separate than a threat to the public health, safety, welfare. But that's something that you do see in a lot of other jurisdictions in their criteria, and a lot of overlap between you know, PUD or conditional use permit, you know, a lot of the other criteria that we had come up with through this process. We looked at Coeur d'Alene, and we actually found quite a few examples of subdivision criteria. Almost all the cities that we looked at had their criteria within their code, so that was a good thing. Plat requirements, all the required for the formal plat have been met, so this meets all the subdivision code requirements. Subdivision code requirements for the, you know, sidewalks, street alleys, all of those are adequate. Complies with the designs, so they have, you know, specific design standards. So usually within a subdivision code, you have those requirements. Block length that, you know, can only be a certain length. Cul-de-sacs can only be used in appropriate situations. You know, things of that nature. Pedestrian connections have to be, if the block, you know, exceeds a certain length, then, you know, pedestrian connections should be looked at. So a lot of those things are built in with your subdivision regulations. The lots proposed in the preliminary plat meet the requirements of the applicable zoning district. It's a little, yeah, just ties back to your, you know, subdivision, your city code requirements. Caldwell, and taking a look at their regulations, pretty consistent with the rest of them and ours. City code, comp plan, public services are adequate. I think we probably like this one the best out of all of them, and you know, the proposed criteria at the end, I think, reflect probably the first three in this, and then we have an additional one after that. But really like the simplicity of the language of, you know, city code. We've got the comp plan, and then the public services and utilities are available or can be made available and are adequate to accommodate the proposed subdivision. Like the way that one was worded. Plat's consistent with the city transportation master plan, and subdivision preserves natural, scenic, or historical features if applicable. With the transportation master plan, you know, I think it's important to look at that for us. Usually that would be under the comprehensive plan, so like the multimodal transportation plan that was recently completed. We have a thoroughfare plan, which is in our zoning code, or not our zoning, but our comprehensive plan. And so that covers a lot. It has a lot of overlap, so it combines a lot of the other departments' plans and puts it in the comprehensive plan. So like Parks and Recreation Master Plan, there's a chapter on Parks and Rec, and goes through all the park locations and the service areas. You know, like I mentioned before, the multimodal transportation plan, that one looked at a lot of the transportation network and future roadways and roadway designations. And we'll have to go back through that and maybe update the thoroughfare plan. But I think last time I looked at it, it was fairly consistent with what we currently had under the comp plan. So, it's not completely necessary to say, our plat's consistent with the multimodal transportation plan, because just saying that it's consistent with the comp plan really covers a lot of those plans that we adopt through various other departments. McCall's is by far the most complex, and it's really crafted in kind of a negative way. If you look in the paragraph in the beginning, it doesn't take a whole lot of time to go through with approval, recommending approval. Really, it just needs to meet the general and specific plans. So really the city code, the zoning code, and the comprehensive plan needs to be consistent with those in order for approval. And then it goes through all the reasons. So if you meet any one of those reasons, is means for denial of a subdivision plat within McCall. So you have some pretty specific things on that, and that's really unique to McCall. You don't really see that anywhere else, where they have listed things that if you meet, then it automatically gets denied.
Why do they say not consistent all the time? What in the world is that all about? I don't get it. It seems really negative.
Yeah.
And this must have been written just after Manchester came to town for a while, and people were really angry. That it seems to be something haywire. Let's go on to some other town.
We looked at Post Falls, and they're a little bit more detail-oriented in their criteria, I guess. They make reference to water supply systems adequate for quantity, quality, or type of subdivision, public sewage system. Usually you'd have some broad statement about adequate utility service instead of just breaking those out separately like that. But they are good to have and think about. Proposed streets are consistent with the transportation element of the comprehensive plan. They certainly want a real specific look at that, even though you could say that's consistent with the comprehensive plan, and you would still have that covered. And then they have some other detailed ones. Soil topographical conditions present hazards that have been identified. The uses of these areas are compatible with those conditions. Subdivision zone, so it meets the proper zone, conforms to all the requirements of the city code. And then you have more of a fiscal analysis question at the end. I don't know how you would go about satisfying or justifying that without some type of fiscal impact analysis that would be required to be done prior to approving that criteria. Sun Valleys was good as well. So it meets all the requirements, conforms to the comp plan, availability of existing public services, anticipated to meet the needs. So similar to Caldwell's. Necessity for off-site improvements to connect the proposed subdivision to existing public services and utilities. It's an odd one, number 5, financial capability of the city and other public agencies to provide required additional municipal services to the proposed development. Another fiscal impact analysis question. Compliance of the proposed subdivision with the design improvement standards. So it's really just the subdivision code, relating it back to that. Meridian, pretty consistent with all the rest of them. I don't know that they kind of tie into the public financial capability of supporting services. A lot of these are tied back to the health, safety, and welfare. And then they do list preserve significant natural, scenic, or historic features. Across the border in Pullman, they always have a little bit different of a structure than Idaho cities have when we've looked at theirs. Consistency with the comp plan and the zoning code, and then they make specific provisions for all these things: health, safety, welfare, open space, drainage, streets, everything that really should be in your subdivision development standards. They just list those one by one. Whether the public use or interest will be served by the subdivision, and dedications proposed. So coming back to our current criteria, there's a lot of overlap. Some of these that we've gone through, you've seen not a whole lot of overlap, but this is one that you see kind of a consistent theme when you go through the other ones. We'd gone through and kind of reworded these a little bit, so taking number 1, number 2, those are almost entirely the same. Proposed subdivisions in conformance with applicable city code requirements, and so that's going to cover subdivision code, zoning code, all other city code provisions. Proposed subdivisions in general conformance with the comp plan. And then I think we've expanded, kind of taken apart number 5 into broken that apart into say that I think this is the same language as Caldwell. Public services and utilities are available or can be made available and are adequate to accommodate the proposed subdivision, and that the proposed subdivision will not be detrimental to the public health, safety, and welfare.
I'm surprised that the health, safety, and welfare line isn't in every one. I just noted that Ullman had it and we have it. There was one other, but quite a few people. It seems to me like that's the apple pie and mother line that gives us the rationale to exist as an agency. But I do like trying to be more general than I don't care for Pullman's desire to make lists, because then there's always something that falls in between the list, and I think we want to have an attitude toward the way we do it, rather than say, well, don't forget about Hog Creek or something. It seems silly to try and do that. I always think of Washington as being really wonderful and way ahead of us, but that doesn't seem to be follow that.
I'm kind of thinking back to the couple of financial, particularly I think the ones that said, and I agree with you about whether you would be required to do some kind of an assessment, but I like the idea that there was a comment that can the city afford to provide this service? I don't know. That seems to me to, I don't know if it's implied in this or if there's a way that the city determines whether it can afford to supply whatever services are needed for that. I don't know. It strikes a chord with me that it really ought to be a part of this.
I feel like 3 addresses that. So when I sat on city council in Troy, we had a subdivision go in, and the subdivision ordinance was not strong enough, and the developer, the city actually we had to have a court case and to get him to finish and do certain things. Another developer wanted to go in as you come down the grade, and they, by that time, because of what had happened up on the hill, everybody was very aware of what a new subdivision could do with, and we knew we couldn't draw the water. We could not provide the public services, and so there was a ton of talk about how to make sure that the city can do all that kind of stuff. So I feel like number 3, in supporting what Nels was saying, is addressing that public services and utilities are available and can be made available and are adequate to accommodate the proposed subdivision, because if they're not, then they have to take care of it, or they have to tell you how they're going to take care of it. So I feel like that is general enough to say that when Nels was talking about the attitude of the idea, that to me addresses your
well, as long as it does, I'm comfortable with that. I just want, but I think it has to be factored in somehow, and if it's implied in that, then I'm comfortable.
Yeah, I
with
was
that.
thinking about the same thing, that it's possible that it's implied.
Yeah, I'm kind of taking
Yeah.
it literally, because the fact that it's available or can be made available to me is different than can we afford to make it available.
Yeah.
That was where I was kind of drawing the distinction. So, I don't know if it's.
I think that wouldn't that come under can be made available if there's no money, it can't be made available.
Yeah.
You know, I would think that a planning and zoning commission sitting in a public hearing would be trying to hang the fiscal on item 3.
Yeah, and that's fine. I'm comfortable with that as
Yeah.
long as you feel like legally
Yeah.
that case could be made. So I
Yeah.
could be comfortable with that.
And I think there's a little bit of overlap with number 4 too, with the health, safety, and general welfare. You know, a lot of this is as far as paying for that is built in. You know, we don't necessarily have impact fees, but close to it with our rate structure and, you know, the fees for connecting to services. We charge general facilities charges anytime you connect to the sewer system, and they do rate studies in order to ensure that, you know, each person, each lot that hooks up to city services is going to be paying their share
Okay.
in order to sustain the system.
Okay.
And so they usually, yeah.
Given the pace of development in Moscow over the last decade or so, which is sort of steady but slow,
Right.
it's not a. I guess I don't anticipate major problems. We don't have something like you experienced in Troy, where a moderate-sized subdivision is very big for the town of Troy. We take 1,000-lot subdivision, which I can't see anybody proposing for Moscow anytime soon.
No, but it just made everybody very aware of
Yeah.
what the water system could. I mean, it kind of laid
Yeah.
out who would be responsible for the maintenance and taking care of and continuing to
Yeah.
do all the services. And so, the town came forward and said, "Wait, we can't feel like we can't
Right.
afford it."
Yeah, with the can be made available clause, I mean, could that cover something like, well, yeah, if we had X number of dollars to run a new water main out to this area where you want to put into the subdivision, then it could be made available.
Yeah, and a lot of that is going to lie with a subdivision developer. You know, it'd be the developer that would bear the responsibility or incur the cost of extending that sewer main. You know, maybe it's 100 yards away from the subdivision. You know, they would be that responsible for extending that. The city wouldn't. Maybe the city could participate in upsizing the line to ensure that, you know, further on down the line, we're still going to have capacity for, you know, future subdivisions. But the developer is responsible for all infrastructure.
It perhaps might be more critical at some time in the future to ask the question of whether water availability is adequate.
And I guess
That's perhaps the crunch
Yeah.
for
And
Moscow.
when we have the adjudication, you know, I think we'll know at that point how much there is and who gets it, and probably have maybe a bit different conversation then.
Do we know when that's supposed to happen?
They're just starting that right now. Yeah, where
Takes
our whole watershed is, I think, is starting that process.
Well, do you think it'll take 2 years or?
I don't know. Usually it takes quite a while. It just
Adjudication.
depends on how, you know, they've got to look up who has water rights, and you know, sometimes that research can be years and years. So I'm not really sure.
Southern Idaho took about 20 years.
Yeah. So I mean, so much research is involved, and you know, then it could probably be tied up in court cases, you know, after that. So I couldn't begin to tell you.
The Southern Idaho one was a much smaller area, but it's still, it gets everybody stirred up, and it's like a decade, wouldn't be surprising.
Yeah.
What about the natural, scenic, and historic features? Is that all too subjective, or to have anything about them?
I think in dealing with these, it is. You know, I think that, like I mentioned before, I think it's probably more important to have those things included in your subdivision ordinance, and be able to, you know, just do it that way with design standards for subdivisions, as opposed to having something that subjective of just saying preservation of natural features. I mean,
Right.
what are natural features? I like natural features, but
Yeah.
it's just, you got to expect that there is going to be quite a bit of grading that happens to put in streets and grading lots for development, and
Could be
you
sticky.
can't build on a
Yeah.
lot that's 30% slope. So and what do you preserve, the tops of the hillsides, the bottoms? It's real subjective about what's of greater importance. So I think the best way to do it is just try to integrate it into our subdivision regulations somehow.
Mike, as I recall, of these things that come to pass, by the time they get to planning and zoning, there's been a lot of research done by the city building department, and lots of engineers involved that look at those kind of things you're talking about.
Yeah, they're
Capacities, utilities, and all the,
yeah.
how they're going to fit that.
They do,
in.
yeah. And, a lot of, and a lot of it's, they have a main that's proposed, and maybe the city does provide some funding for upsizing mains just to make sure that the next person is able to connect to it. But yeah, they review all of that prior to it to coming to us. That's why or coming to you. That's why you have a lot of conditions on those sometimes, just because there needs to be some changes done from what they're proposing. So.
As far as historic preservation, essentially all subdivisions occur on the edges of the city with
less
agricultural land. With
Everything we're thinking about is interior, historically at
Yeah.
least. And I think your comment about growth, if, as I taught urban theory over years, the 2% growth factor is anybody that's gone more than 2% a year really needs to start worrying about the things we're talking about, because as Boise grew for 15, 20 years, they were growing at 3.5%, 4%. It's a nightmare, and you can't always think that your sewer and water lines are going to be keeping up. But because we have to strain to get even close to 1%, we're protected by our lack of services that we offer, because I don't think any corporation of any sensibility is going to come to a town that doesn't have water. And we don't have water, and that's just a fact of life, and that's something we just have to figure out how to live with. But it doesn't allow, if you have a river running through it, it's a whole different world. I grew up in the floodplain of Boise, where you could 10 feet dig down 10 feet and you're at water, and boy, there was never any question. Digging down 600 feet is hard.
Well,
It's pretty good, Mike.
more comments to Mike about. I sort of think I'm hearing a consensus that he's pretty much on target.
In some ways, this is easier too, I think, because for a number of years, we had more subdivisions than we've been having just recently, and we tested the subdivision ordinance a lot more. Everything out past Mountain View all kind of grew in the last 30 years, and there's been a lot of some things we don't see as often. You need anything other than just a nod, or do we need?
Yeah, I think just as long as everybody's happy with what we've got there.
Looks good.
So everybody's happy?
Good.
So, this wraps it up. So I think we'll go ahead and package up all the rest of the criteria that we've been looking at and put it into a, legislative form and bring it back, and have another opportunity to go through them all one by one. So.
Okay, good. Okay, item 8, residential rental unit and off-street parking.
So, I just wanted to go through a little bit of I wouldn't say an issue, but something that has given us a little bit of concern over about the last probably 6 months to a year. The trend to build some larger scale, I guess, single-family, two-family dwellings with a number of bedrooms in them. Some of them have 6, some of them have 8 bedrooms in them, with really the intention of just kind of being some, more geared toward residential housing, just in the location that they're being built in. And so I wanted to kind of go over, possible amendment to our parking regulations through this. And I wanted to start out with a little bit of background. You may recall at a point in time we had an issue with kind of boarding houses, or a number of unrelated individuals living in houses, and this is just kind of the nature of living in a college town. But we had done a couple things. I think it was around 2006. We implemented a noise ordinance. You see the report every year to council. I think that's curbed a lot of the nuisance-related activity in some neighborhoods. But we also redefined how the definition of what a family is. And so before, we may have had, there's really 3 or 4 parts to the definition of family. The first one is one or more related persons living together as a single housekeeping unit in a dwelling unit. So it doesn't draw a distinction. So if you have a single family dwelling, regardless of whether you rent it out to a family or live in it with your family, there's really no distinction between renting and owning within the city that we make, at least for dwellings. And so if you look at further on in the definitions, this is one that really applies to the maybe a college situation where you have not more than 4 persons living together as one single housekeeping unit in a dwelling unit, when one or more of them is not related to any other person in such dwelling unit. And so this used to be 6. And so at the time when we were reworking this, we ended up reducing it from 6 to 4 unrelated individuals, and we did a couple other changes. I think this one was in there before. This is another definition of family: 2 persons that are not related and any number of additional persons related to them. So what that really means is just 2 families, as long as they're living together as a single housekeeping unit. And that's the difference. Is they may have their own separate bedrooms, but they all share a kitchen and kind of those common housekeeping facilities that are typically within a house, and there's really no separation other than just personal space within bedrooms. And during that time, I think our planning department or city attorney wanted to have kind of maybe a safety valve in order to allow more than 4 unrelated individuals to live in a house. And it was usually through a conditional use permit in most all residential zones, or allowed by right in R4. And what they had created was a residential rental unit. And that's defined as a dwelling unit that is not occupied by its owner and where more than 4 unrelated persons reside. And so, I think it caps you at 6. So you're allowed 2 additional unrelated individuals, but you have to go through the process. And they wanted to just allow that opportunity for certain circumstances. And so they created the residential rental unit. It's created some confusion with a lot of people in the public, commissions, staff. It's confusing that it's a residential rental unit, and so a lot of people just assume that, well, that means renting my house, and we don't draw that distinction between home ownership and renting. And so a lot of times we'll get calls and somebody will say, well, somebody's renting the house next door, don't they need to go and get a conditional use permit for a residential rental unit? And then we have to go through, really it's just an occupancy exceedance allowance is really what a residential rental unit is. And so I think part of this is that we'd like to re-term what that is, and maybe just, and this kind of ties into our use table when we're going through all the uses and combining those in a table format. I think what we'd envisioned with a residential rental unit is just to allow, something tokened, residential occupancy exceedance allowance. So we haven't really quite landed on what the maybe proper term's going to be. But maybe it's just an occupancy exceedance allowance that allows 2 additional unrelated individuals to live in a.
Was that designated by zone or in all zones? Or?
Well, it's a little it's kind of odd because it's a structure is a single family dwelling. Residential rental unit's really a use, right? And so it's hard to, maybe they first build the dwelling and there's 6 bedrooms and, they just build a single family dwelling. But then the use changes and they have, residential rental unit. But it is in all residential zones with the exception, and it's all through a conditional use permit. And so, the Board of Adjustment reviews these on a kind of a case-by-case basis. But in R4, it's allowed by right. But there is some specific, so I go through that, there is some specific language that comes along with it. And in each zone, it states that with conditions that are adequate, conditions that adequate off-street parking be provided and that the use will not change the character of the neighborhood. And so those are really the criteria that the Board of Adjustment is, looking at when they're reviewing a residential rental unit. And I think that adequate off-street parking is really important because every person that lives in each of those bedrooms could have a car, and that could have an effect on the neighborhood. Changing the character of the neighborhood is real subjective. That's a tough one. If it's in R4, and the code allows staff to make interpretations and to exercise our power to use the code, implement the code. And so we're like in an R4 situation where it doesn't go to the Board of Adjustment, so they don't have the opportunity to review it. It's just us, implementing this portion of the code. It's usually reasonable to ask for a couple additional off-street parking spaces be created, but for the change the character of the neighborhood in an R4 zone, which already allows multifamily dwellings and 2-family dwellings, it's real subjective, and I don't know that there would ever be a case where it changed the character of the neighborhood when you're maybe in a single-family dwelling and you just allow a couple additional occupants and you've got a multifamily structure right next door. So that's always kind of been problematic to us, and we've always looked at trying to get rid of that language.
But are we going to talk about what adequate off-street parking is in the case of a CUP?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. So that brings us to our current off-street parking requirements. And so single-family dwellings just require 2 off-street parking spaces. 2-family dwellings, it's 2 per dwelling unit, and so you'd have 4 total. If you had the case of a duplex, you need 2 for one side and 2 for the other. When we start to get into multifamily, we require just 1.25 stalls per dwelling unit. 2-bedroom multifamily is going to be 1.7 stalls per dwelling unit. And then you start to get to 3 or more bedrooms, and we start to break it out so that it's 0.7 stalls per bedroom or 1 stall per bedroom when you have direct access to designated arterial collector streets. And the reason for that increase is that, usually you don't allow on-street parking, as you're probably aware from some of the recent subdivisions that have come through, on collectors or arterial streets. So parking's a little bit more problematic. So if you were to look at kind of this comparison of off-street parking for residential uses by bedroom, looking at a 2-family dwelling unit, it's just going to be 2, even if they have 10 bedrooms in each side. They're only going to be required to provide 2 off-street parking spaces. And when you compare that to what a typical multifamily requirement is, once you get up to 6 bedrooms, we always round up on fractions. So even if you've got 2.25, we round up to 3. So you're starting to look at 5 bedroom or 5 stalls required for a multifamily apartment up to 6 bedrooms. So. And really, it's similar in nature, even though they aren't a multifamily. It's being used similarly to a multifamily development. And there was one that was pretty close proximity to campus, and I know that their parking office really had an issue with it because maybe they're only required to have, I think it was 4 stalls at the rear of the property, and a lot of these are taking lots, because in R3, R4 we allow multiple structures on a single piece of property, so they're able to utilize the rear yard. A lot of them have alley access, and so they're able to utilize the rear yard to build another structure on that site, and it's usually just single family or 2 family dwellings, and they'll just put one on the rear of the property. And I think in this case there was 4 parking spaces off of the alley, and this was right next to campus. I mean, it's private property, but in all reality it probably should be university-owned property, but it's not. And if you looked at the parking office was sending us pictures, and it was just they had an angle stalls in the back, and they were instead of angled, they were parking at a 90-degree angle, and it was weren't even really paying attention to the wheel stops, and you had a lot of overflow onto the university lot right next door. And so you probably saw in this particular circumstance they built a single family dwelling, and there was 8 bedrooms in that dwelling, and you're that close proximity to campus. It's really I don't believe that a family would move into that location. It's going to be really used for some type of university rental housing. And so the parking really just became a problem in that case. So but the typical is about 5 to 6 bedrooms per dwelling unit, and that was the one I was just referring to with the 8 bedrooms. That really, like I said, the intent's clearly to provide some type of rental housing, and we think it's fine. It's just that I think the off-street parking needs to be increased in order to account for a reasonable expectation about how many cars students or people living in the property are going to have. So 2 stalls for 8-bedroom single-family dwelling is or 4 stalls for a 12-bedroom 2-family dwelling. Really not adequate for the parking demand. And that really just overflows onto on-street parking, and so you have kind of some of these circumstances, or a lot of these are being built in Allman-Asbury area where the parking's already constrained, and you probably have a lot of university students that end up parking on the street and then walking to class. At some point in time, we'll probably the city will probably look at instituting some type of residency permit on those streets, just because of how crowded they are when you drive down them. So you have that issue. You have an issue of kind of overflowing to surrounding private parking areas, and parking in maybe another a complex or house down the street and in their private parking, or maybe overflowing into business parking type of thing. And then you just kind of have the adverse impacts that creates to the surrounding neighborhood. And so, like I mentioned before, it's hard for us to really control uses. It's more that the structure comes in, we realize it's going to be 6 to 8 bedrooms. Whether or not they intend to use it as a residential rental unit or not, I think the market's going to drive that to a certain extent when they see that, well, I've got 8 bedrooms and I live right next to the university, and I'm limited to 4 unrelated individuals, and there's just going to be a tendency to, put 8 people in there, 1 per bedroom, because you're going to get, $400, $500 per bedroom for somebody renting out. You're going to realize a lot more money if you do it that way. So, it's good for us to be able to do this in the beginning. So when they come in for the building permit for the structure, in order to require the parking, and because usually when they're laying out the buildings on the site, and they know the parking requirement they need to maybe satisfy the residential rental unit standard. They can account for that at the time, put the parking that's needed in, and they don't have to come back after the fact. And when there's an issue that arises, maybe a neighbor complains and says, well, they have more than 4 unrelated individuals there, and then it's real problematic just because of personal property, private property. It's really hard for us to be able to determine actually how many people are living in a house. We usually ask for lease agreements type of thing if we have a complaint, but it's just really challenging, and going through the building permit process and requiring it at that point in time is really the easiest for us to be able to catch that and require parking, and easiest for the person that is building these structures to be able to accommodate the parking on site, so they can use that, the best use of the property, or whatever, the market's going to drive them to, use on the property. So, what we propose with this, and, we're looking for your direction, we would like to propose amending the parking table for single-family and two-family dwellings to provide 1 additional off-street parking space for each bedroom over 4 bedrooms. And so, you look at what that does. It doesn't have a great effect, but once you start getting into 5-6 bedroom dwellings, it would just increase, and it'd make it more consistent to the multifamily dwelling units. You may think that, well, what if I want to build a giant house in R1 zone and I've got 6 bedrooms there? Usually you're going to meet that standard anyway, because you have a 2-car garage, and then you're going to have 2 spots in front of the garage, and you're going to have plenty of room to be able to do that. And so, I don't think that is ever going to become an issue. But I think that minor amendment to the parking table would be suitable, I guess, for those types of uses that are starting to be more attractive. And going single-family, two-family, and putting a large number of bedrooms in as opposed to multifamily, there are some advantages. Once you start getting into multifamily, you're required to meet all ADA requirements. ADA parking spaces, accessible routes, accessible units, and so it has become kind of more and more attractive to go instead of maybe multifamily buildings. You've seen, a lot of those start to happen on White Avenue, where they'll have duplexes, side by side, all in the same lot, similar to multifamily, with a common parking lot in the middle. But they'll go towards duplexes instead of multifamily structures, just because you're exempt from a lot of the requirements, and maybe you have a steep lot, you can't, make a bunch of switchbacks to get, ADA facilities in there. And so that, it's kind of a trend that we've seen.
Comments for Mike?
Seems like a pretty good change to me.
I remember a while ago we talked about, and I can't remember what the outcome of it was, but we were talking about stacked parking to meet some of these requirements. Does that factor into this at all?
Well, we had clarified that in the code. So right now, for single family and two family, we allow tandem parking. Multifamily, we inserted language in there which allows tandem parking in circumstances where there's designated garages. So if you have I think there was one development on White Avenue that came forward, and they had proposed that each unit has a garage in it. And so, it allows, I think, satisfy up to about 25% of your requirement, all the ones that are in those garage spaces. But single family, two family, right now we allow tandem. It would just be that once you go over 4 parking spaces, then you've got to meet our parking lot standards, which doesn't allow tandem except in multifamily. But right now, single family, two family are exempt. It's just that if you have let's say you have a single family at the front of the house or at the front of the property, and you put a two-family dwelling on the rear of the property, well, you've got 2 spaces required for the single family, and you've got 4 spaces required for the two family. Say you have an alley coming out the back of it, and you put more than 4 parking spaces, you're going to be required to pave it. You've we've got to meet all of our standards. You've got to put a sidewalk in front of it. And that at that point, once it goes over 4, then we don't allow the tandem parking. So
That sounds complicated.
it is, yeah. I mean,
Well, the tandem, in case you don't know who is parking where, allows somebody to park somebody in.
Right.
yeah, and you know, the reason we've exempted it up to this point for single family and 2-family is because you know, you got 4 stalls.
Hopefully
you
the key is hanging on a nail somewhere.
You should be able to have tandem because, you know, you don't have a number of units there. It's, you know, just jockeying cars as you would in your own house. So,
What would this change allow us to eliminate from the code? Does it eliminate the definition of a family?
it doesn't. No, right now the only thing we're proposing to change is just the addition of 1 stall per bedroom over 4. You know, it's anticipated that when we rename residential rental unit to add 2, that'll be 1 change that'll occur, and then it'll just eliminate residential rental unit. We'll still have the same definition of family. It'll just be rewording it so that maybe it's a occupancy exceedance allowance, and you go through a conditional use permit to have, it'd be really the same process that we're doing now, only instead of the language about the character of the neighborhood, just to have 2 additional people living in a house. I don't think that's going to be a detriment, deal breaker to the neighborhood. So I think that moving that to just occupancy, like through a conditional use permit, state gives us the authority to do those things that may be viewed as variances. So building height, some zones we allow you, maybe the limit's 65, but you can go exceed that through a conditional use permit. It'd be similar to that. It'd be maybe right under single family dwelling, and then you'd have occupancy exceedance allowance by 2, and then it would just conditional use permit across the board except maybe R4, which if we kept the same structure where it was just allowed by right in R4. So it'd just be, we really wouldn't be changing a whole lot other than just making it maybe a little bit simpler and easier for people to understand, what we're really meaning by a residential rental unit. Because I don't think that, mostly everybody I think asked me that question, doesn't understand what that
boarding house.
Yeah.
So presently, the reason that you've had to propose this is you've had calls from neighbors and people, and the parking's gotten to be more congested.
Yeah, it's mainly been, we had...
Are there certain pockets, and you're seeing pockets that this is happening throughout the community, or is this community-wide?
Well, only R3 and R4 allow multiple structures per lot. On R1, R2 don't. And so it's just in those areas. And so areas that you would already have multifamily or 2-family structures, and and it's just more or less not really an issue with neighborhood character. It's just been the parking has really been the problem, because if they do a multifamily development, we're able to capture the number of bedrooms, and then they're able to put in the required number of spaces. It's just that going towards this model with 8 bedrooms in a single family dwelling that may be used more like a dormitory type situation.
Well, that's the reason I was asking, because you've mentioned a couple times about the character phrasing. So do you have a proposal, you think, like you want to take it out? Or
that would be,
you just want to
we would probably just do away with the residential rental unit, provided that the character of consistent with the character of the neighborhood and adequate off-street parking. We would just eliminate that, and just to say that single family dwelling with an optional occupancy exceedance allowance of 2, so that would get you up to 6 unrelated individuals, kind of what it is right now under residential. And then when we amend the parking table, if we do that, that would capture the adequate off-street parking. We wouldn't have to interpret that every time somebody wants to do something like this. they would have the standard that, well, if I build this number of bedrooms, this is the requirement, and it's all clear, and then remove the whole character of the neighborhood, because, like I mentioned, these are all going in R3, R4 anyway, and, to say that a single-family dwelling with 6 unrelated individuals is going to affect the character of a neighborhood that has, duplexes and multifamily structures in it, it'd be kind of a hard argument to make.
Yeah, it seems like a big part of the confusion is just that term residential rental unit when it's actually talking about density.
Yeah.
And then this looks like a good compromise to me, because it seems like the only person that could really get caught by this is someone that really does have 5 kids and wants to build a house and give each kid a bedroom.
Yeah.
But out of those 5 kids, there's a good chance that at some point 2 of them are going to be driving cars.
Yeah.
So I think upping the parking requirements is more than reasonable.
What is, that addresses the issue going forward. What does that do for the current problems that are out there?
Well, we have a number of these that are in review right now, and so I think we're working with the ones that are currently under review in order to, our Bill Belknap, my boss, had issued kind of a interpretation of, at least in R4, of what adequate parking would mean, and it's similar to, or it's consistent with what we proposed for the amendment. And so, the ones that have already been permitted, we can't go back and say you've got to put in, a couple more parking spaces. It's really just moving forward from here. The ones that are currently still in review under our department, we still have the opportunity to base it off of this interim guidance and say that, you need to have 1 or 2 additional spaces. But the ones that have been issued, even if they're under construction right now, we can't go back and say that you have to come put it in.
This is the don't dig the hole any deeper amendment.
Yeah.
I think I'm hearing, again, consensus. Any contrary views?
Sounds reasonable.
Well, I think it'd be pretty simple, so I think we'll probably just get a legislative draft amendment put together and probably have it for next time.
Okay. Which brings us to the end of our agenda. Yeah, okay. Rob?
I don't want us to lose sight of the conversation that we had last week about, it was more related to snow removal and trash, and the problem is going to double in another week when we have both trash and the large bins. And I was thinking this is going to become not exclusively a snow removal issue. I was thinking about some of the places that you were showing us last week, and when we got now maybe 2 units sharing a driveway, and they're going to have 4 bins out there, and they have to be 3 feet across or apart. I mean, I think we're in for some issues that need to be addressed. And I just don't want us as a group to let go of the issues. So I'm kind of hoping that maybe we can. And I really liked Nell's suggestion last time about let's get out and look and maybe take some tours. But I don't know exactly what the appropriate way for us to approach this.
Do you think the sanitation has? I haven't read it carefully, but are we still going to try and pick up a garbage and recycle stuff on the same day?
That's what the guidance that I got.
And that seems to present some problems. I mean, you could imagine if they could be alternated in some way. I don't know what the commission who is dealing with that, but I'm just in our own case, I don't have because we're on an alley and because we're on a corner and because we have quite a few places to put things, but a lot of people that only have, let's say, a 50-foot wide or even a 40-foot wide frontage seems to me like it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's going to be challenging.
I think it's going to be challenging. I guess I might suggest that some readings, which I think was what was suggested in the minutes from 2 weeks ago, for our assigned reading would be a good idea. I think that might be a good prelude to actually doing some site visits. But I think we should do both. Mike, if you can find some, or if anybody who can find some good readings, related to frontage distance and snow and garbage pickup and so on.
It's such a snotty problem that people don't write about it so much, I mean, it's
Got to be a dissertation.
but look.
Well, it's
let's
contrary
look at
to
some
the densification goal, which we keep pushing.
Have you gone and ridden behind the truck and Pullman since they do single stream? So again, I was sanitation commissioner in Troy, so I tried to ride in the truck, but you can't. So I rode behind the truck and followed the truck around, and then just following the route was an education of itself. So if you have the time, that was really informative. And then talking with the men and women that work on the trucks, because they know so intimately what they need to do, why they're doing it, and they're the ones that really have things to say about what they see that could be changed. And the last council meeting, Joe Johnson was here, and he was like, please talk to me. So let's talk to him.
I think our education could probably benefit from including some of our managerial staff from the garbage pickup and snow removal in a discussion.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if they've done any work on figuring out how the multiple bins is all going to work. And
It just seems
it's
like,
gonna cross with
we've now
moving
got
snow.
ourselves in two kinds of people with alleys and people without alleys. And more than that, I've said this before, but it bears repeating, I think. I was shocked a couple of years ago. I was doing some research in Clarkston. My wife and I were riding up and down the alleys of Clarkston. And do you know, Clarkston isn't Bel Air. But their alleys are paved in Clarkston. I don't know how that happened, but a lot of our alleys, I get a little bit misguided, because the only alley I live on is one of the paved, beautiful alleys in town that people really use. But so many alleys are allowed to get overgrown and stuff sticking out there. And one wonders if we have, I feel like as whoever's dealing with this issue's got to deal with those two kinds of people, the people that don't have alleys and the people that do. But we have at least our center city is quite a lot of alleys. But if you go and either drive down them or walk down them, you'll find out that they haven't always been well taken care of. And I don't know whether that presents us whether there's any helpful guidance there or not. So we happen to have an alley that the trucks can race down, and it's wide enough and it's paved, and so it really works. And all the trucks in the world use it, but as I've looked at some of the alleys, I see that they're not as easy to get down, even though they might still be the 20 feet. I don't know how they've been encroached on or
Yeah, there's usually 20 feet of right-of-way, but in reality, they're maybe 12 feet wide.
There's a simple solution. You just have two totally separate street grids, one for utilities. Slightly expensive.
Well,
We'll look for some readings, see if there must, maybe there is some out there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's still been on my radar. I've been working on it.
Well, the reason I mentioned that I did is I actually had a conversation with one of the sanitation people, and that's my suggestion of, he was full. He does it weekly, right? So he had lots of things to say and wanted to say we could do it this way, we could do it this way, and I just was like, come on forward.
Who's the commission? Who deals with sanitation, Michael?
Well, Tim Davis is our sanitation manager, so he works directly with LSI, Lake House Sanitation.
Right. But is there anything like a group or a commission or anything that looks who?
Commission on Alleys.
It's really the city council.
And it comes to Public Works.
Yeah.
Oh, the city council. Oh, well, lucky you.
So what happened is they've been talking and stuff, and that's why in the last council meeting, that's why the suspension of, so that alley pickups will still exist. So I think there needs to be more information about how best to do this for our community. I just think we haven't had enough conversation about it yet to feel like we're doing it the way we want to be doing it. I think there's plenty of information. It just hasn't been consolidated.
Just thinking about alleys, and I lived in New York City while I was in grad school, and of course the shocking thing is that New York doesn't have alleys. And so, those of you who have stayed up late till 2 in the morning in New York City know that all the garbage is just sitting on the sidewalk. Hello. Yeah. And yet, by morning, magically, it's gone. And so, it is an interesting thing, and I know we don't have that kind of money, but it was shocking to me to, you go out, decide to go out and have a few drinks, and you're stumbling home at 1 o'clock in the morning, and wow, there's just this humongous piles of stuff everywhere.
Usually coming up in the basement.
Yeah. Right, they come out of everywhere. So there has to be ways to solve some of these things, but they might not be as bucolic as you think, because clearly the trash people in New York City don't get off at 5 o'clock in the evening. So there's, I guess there are people in New York who are willing to work in the night.
Well, we will continue these conversations probably over a range of future meetings. So our next meeting will be at 2 weeks from now, and we are adjourned.